Welcome to the Parts Girl podcast. I'm excited to be interviewing the founders of PartsEdge, who have been powering the podcast for 2 years now. We just hit 100 episodes. So I'm excited to be interviewing you guys on just why and what inspired you guys to start PartsEdge. So we're going to dig deep in some questions. So the first question is, what inspired you to start PartsEdge? And just kind of give us a little story on how it all started. And you guys have two very different stories, so I want to hear from both of you. Don't just
Go, Cliff.
Yeah, one of you guys start.
Wow. Okay, you're gonna make me go first. Yeah. So
yeah, you go first.
So I'll start off real quick. So we started PartsEdge. Chuck and I started PartsEdge for a couple of reasons. One of them was we gotten together because Chuck was working at a dealership, a local dealership, and I was working for a DMS vendor. And Chuck was by far the smartest user I'd ever met. And he was just doing some amazing things at his dealership with his DMS. And I immediately took interest. Chuck had requests for everything from custom programming to, maybe some training on, how to use some of the reporting, parts of reporting for capturing data mainly onto a, we would call it a laptop or a desktop back then, but it was a lunchbox sized computer that he carried around with him everywhere back in the old days. And that's how we met.
How many ships were you working with, like when you were with that DMS provider? Like how many?
Oh, it was hundreds.
Yeah.
It was a big provider. So I'm not sure if it's appropriate to say the name here, but
that's okay.
Yeah, I was a big DMS provider. I was working with a lot of dealerships. I worked with another DMS provider before that, covered the whole state of New Mexico and about half of Texas and half of Arizona. And still, even then, by far, Chuck was the one user using the system way past its capabilities. And that's really how we met. Chuck asked for some custom programs. He asked for the ability to work off site, which, Chuck, back then, no one did that.
When you say back then, what year was this?
Late 80s. Chuck would go to Montana every year to visit, and he would take an LA 120, which is a desk size printing terminal with a keyboard on it, with him in his Chrysler minivan to go on vacation.
Yeah. I left it there. Well, I left it there then.
Yeah. But
Okay, so going back, you guys met and you thought he was the smartest parts manager operator, and he was asking you lots of questions
then
for him.
Yeah.
So then how did it all start? So that he was asking you the questions, so then you executed, you made it happen, and then where did it come from?
Kind of. So I was working for the DMS vendor. Chuck was working at a dealership, and it was big enough to be a dealer group, but at that point I think it was one or two dealerships, but it was a big dealership. And I had broken off from the DMS business and gone out on my own into data collection, into a different business, mainly DMS related data collection. And Chuck and I would talk periodically. We would joke all the time. And, I would very humorously offer him the job at the lowest pay possible. And, even the very successful parts manager wouldn't even think of it. And one day he didn't really say yes to my offer, but he said, hey, I want to do something. We want to do this. We were doing something. He was doing something in his dealership, and he wanted to do it at more dealerships. And so how we started PartsEdge, we were doing something that was working really good at Carl Berger. He was doing something really good, and he had pretty much directed me to write programs and do stuff that made his job easier and what he did more effective. And I think PartsEdge formally started when other dealers started asking him if he would do it for them.
Okay.
And then we started doing it for them too. And that's really how PartsEdge started.
And that's so then what was the specific problem or challenge that you guys were solving? And maybe for Chuck.
I'll pass it on to Chuck.
Yeah.
One of them was the DMS, because no one was really working the DMS the way we were doing it at Carl Berger. The other way was what Chuck was doing. This wasn't just your average stuff off the menu. This was cutting edge stuff, procedures and stocking policies for those decades, back then. And the DMSs were incapable of doing it without the type of special attention Chuck was paying to the parts and the inventory. And I just kind of got roped into it because he needed someone to do the DMS part.
And here we are. How
Yeah, here we are 30 years later.
30
Yeah.
years later. So that's
Yeah.
another question too, and you can answer both. It's Chuck, is it still, so 30 years later, how, like, it's still relevant, because you're talking about 30 years ago, how, the technology, no one was doing these kinds of things. It's still the same thing. The DMSs, you can still execute a lot of the work and the technology and move it forward. Like, it hasn't improved, basically, the DMSs. Or no, I don't know.
Well, of course, there's been improvements. There's been changes in the market. ASR programs, RIM, Aero, PartsEdge, ASR 2.0. But that still doesn't change the functionality of different commodities, for pricing, day supply, inventory control, those types of things. And the DMSs really haven't had to change much, except they certainly haven't kept up with their reporting. I get people who ask for reports that the two major DMS vendors, they haven't changed their management report in 40 years. So the relevance is they are irrelevant. And that's what we try to do, is bring some relevant, some reports that actually show the inventory in reality instead of trying to adjust them to programs and reports that are 40 years old. That's how we've kind of evolved. Back in the day when Cliff and I started, stock orders were really important. We could set up the algorithms and supplies and stuff like that because you had to run your own stock order, and it was critical that you were ordering the right parts with the right phase and criteria and whatnot. Part of that has kind of gone by the wayside, with the ASR programs. There's still the need to do that to a degree, but now it's a matter of breaking out what's guaranteed, what's not guaranteed. So, it certainly has evolved over 30 years, but like you said, the DMSs, for the most part, they haven't really changed a lot from a parts aspect. They've done a lot in service. They've done a bunch in sales, but parts is kind of like that, slow-moving ox. It's like, we'll get the parts eventually, and they really don't. So there you go. And, parts is important. At a dealership, typically, the dealer only owns two things: used cars and parts. And so, you want to get the best return on investment you can, and that's what we're experts at.
Absolutely. Okay, so can you describe the moment that you realized there was a need in the market? Because you kind of mentioned that, where people were asking you to do what you were doing. But then how has it, we've grown so much in the last several years. So I guess for you each individually, what was that moment where you were like, there's a need for this?
Well, I don't know if I ever really realized there was a moment for it, as much as I realized Cliff brought up going to Montana with a LA 120 deck rider. When I got up there, and at that time, now we're talking ancient, I could run my dealership with a phone line and a couple of pieces of equipment. And I went, dang, if I could do this for our dealership, I could do it for others. And that's where, the first couple of clients that I actually had was before Cliff and I actually started PartsEdge. I actually would go home at night and work with a couple of dealerships in Hemet and Yucca Valley, and then some up in North County. And that's kind of how I finally went to Cliff and said, okay, Cliff, I think we can make this happen. I was a little bit soured with Chrysler and stuff like that, and I'd really taken the dealership I'd worked at as far as I could go, shy of being a general manager. And I was a parts geek, and I wanted to be a parts geek. So I fell back on that, went to Cliff with the idea. We started formulating it, and here we are.
And Cliff, what about you, for your perspective? And just...
Yeah, I noticed it pretty quickly after one of the largest Chrysler dealers in the country, who was a competitor of Chuck's from San Diego. He was from 100 miles north. And Chuck went up to talk to him about doing what we do. He was curious. Factory rep, I think, and connected them together. And the guy said yes pretty quickly. And the reason why he said yes was he was tired of looking at Chuck's delivery trucks from San Diego passing by his dealership to deliver parts to his customers 100 miles away. And he said, and I knew then that if that guy would buy it, it was probably really valuable for every dealer.
Well, let's preface that. He was tired of seeing my trucks go by his dealership at 7:30 in the morning when they were just opening the doors, having a cup of coffee, and we were in his backyard.
Yeah. But make no mistakes about it. They bought from Chuck 100 miles away because he had the parts. He the whole basis of how PartsEdge got started was probably, and Chuck better at explaining it than me, but what I saw as a techie was, you have to buy the right parts. You have to stock the right parts. You have to have the parts when they call you for them. Everybody can get on an order, right? You've got to have them in stock. So you have to know what to stock, and you can't have a lot of waste. And that's what allowed Chuck to, he's selling so many parts. He goes to the depot manager and says, I want my parts dropped off at my dealership at 3 a.m. I don't care. The depot truck would drive right by this guy, past him to deliver parts to Chuck 100 miles away because Chuck wanted his parts at 3, 4 in the morning. And that's how he had his trucks loaded and back up in that guy's neighborhood by 7. So we think every parts department has that potential. Within reason, in every market, there's a parts department with that kind of potential and I'm not talking about dominate the market in a hostile manner, but be so good that they have everything. They service the market with near perfection. And it sounds like something very hard to achieve. At times it is, but Chuck showed me it was possible, and that's really what gave me the confidence to jump in this with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I certainly remember, logistically, we had our failures.
Yeah.
We had, in fact, we ran into this with a slight delivery company that we started for a while, but logistically, getting into certain areas of Southern California were a lot easier than others. And we used to have a mission statement, so to speak, in our operation that we work while our competition sleeps. So we literally had people from 4 a.m. to midnight working every day. And that's how we accomplished some of that. But, we thought, hey, we're doing really good in the Inland Empire. Let's go into downtown L.A. That failed miserably because of the traffic. So, we went, okay, that piece of the pie doesn't work, throw it out. Let's go to the areas we can affect more and do it. And that's how we kind of dominated that market. We're the largest Chrysler dealer in the country, wholesale-wise.
Yeah. You have to try things and test them to see if they're going to work. Just because you failed in that area didn't mean that you failed in the other areas.
Well, and that's to the point that Cliff kind of mentioned. There's the potential for dealerships in the area to do that kind of thing. And if they want to go there, that's what we try to help them accomplish. If they've got that and that's the way they want to drive it, there's a lot of different areas. We're so diverse with the clients we work with. Some people don't want to be in wholesale. Some are huge. You can adjust the systems. That's one thing the DMS systems are good at, being set up dynamically to work based on the way you do business and maximize it.
So that goes back to, I was part of a conversation earlier today of how many tools there are for dealerships, how much software, how many things that they have to do their job. And there's not very much for the parts department. On top of, if you look at the DMS as a whole, I think the percentage of usage or how much they can utilize the software is a lower percentage of its capabilities. Like, I think that's something we talk about with our goal is to get the DMS or get them to utilize the DMS at 50% rather than, 20%. Is that something that you would say that is important to us or something that I think kind of sets us apart? It's not another software for a parts manager to learn. We're utilizing their existing software to make their job easier.
Why reinvent the wheel? Again, Kaylee, you couldn't have said it any better. 15 or 20% of the capabilities on some of these DMSs is all that's ever utilized. We try to, expand on that and utilize that system. And a lot of it is maybe lack of education. More important this day and age, it's really lack of time. These guys just don't have time. He or she, the parts manager, just doesn't have time to engage and sit down and do a lot of training. So I'm not going to blame the DMS vendors. They put the tools out there. I'm going to blame it based on the fact that we're running with such skinny dealerships are running with so few personnel that they're running around like, excuse the pun, chickens like with their head cut off, and trying to carve out a little bit of time, Kaylee, even trying to talk to us. It's oh gosh, I got to take a half hour and talk to these guys. Oh no. That's what I would say. Those DMS systems, some of the great tools they have, they just never get utilized. And in a lot of cases, they don't even know the tools are there.
That's true. What about you, Cliff?
Well, yeah, well, I think our original motto, Chuck motto of working while your competition sleeps has never been more important than it is now. We're running with a lot of staff, a lot more competition. The internet, a lot of technology has made it impossible to compete if you don't use certain tools in this industry. And one of the things that we bring is a staff, a very consistent staff. We do the same thing. We do regular operations in the system that a parts manager doesn't have to worry about it getting done. And we'll do that at 4 o'clock in the morning for some dealers. We'll do it at 8 o'clock at night for other dealers. So they don't have to worry about that at all. We're literally helping them work in their system and manage their inventory and maintain a good inventory while everybody's sleeping sometimes. And, we used to kind of say that with a smile on her face, like there was some sort of humor with it, but really it's mandatory now. If you're not working all the time, you're probably not keeping up. It's really hard to keep up. You're probably spending a lot more time doing things, that you shouldn't be doing. If, you've only got so many hours a day, what do you want to spend them on? So, yeah, we bring a lot of that behind the scenes work to our dealers. And I think that's making one of the biggest differences from having the right inventory, low waste, and 24/7 work going on at times.
Mm-hmm.
On their behalf.
So if you could sum up just the core values or belief, or even just like a mission statement of PartsEdge, what would you say? Like if someone's like, what is PartsEdge's mission? What would you say?
Well, we've been going through this, talking about this, and it really almost has become our mission statement, Kaylee. You put it out there, but I brought it up to my assistant who worked with me, Blake. I said, the thing you got to remember about a dealership parts inventory is that it's not a perfect science. You try and minimize the mistakes and maximize your profit opportunities. That's the mission statement right there is, I just went through it today, and this is a great example of it. I had a parts manager who sent an email and said he's getting beat up because his day's supply is 50 days. And this is a big Ford store. And I went in and pulled his management report and calculated it. And I go, no, you're at a 38-day supply and your true turns is 9.45. You're knocking it out of the park. And I sent him the calculation and the management report. And I said, where are your people getting the 50 days? They've got your inventory overstated by $318,000. Those are the types of things that when you can lay those kind of things out to them and, show them reality versus sometimes I wonder where dealerships get some of these calculations. And anyway, bottom line there, here he's getting beat up and, I don't know if you could get beat up anymore. If I could have 9.5 turns and a 38-day supply, I think you're in the cat's meow right there. So that's what I'm getting at is, there needs to be an education with accurate, calculations and whatnot. And that just seems to be lacking out there this day and age.
I think so. I went on a podcast and we talked about just the key metrics of inventory health. And there's not really a standard out there. And I got so many phone calls, especially from dealers, asking that for that information because it's not standardized or it's just kind of all over the map. And then I think the part of the problem is they're not really sure how to hold the parts managers accountable because there's no standard metrics of inventory health.
Well, and NADA, like day supply, I throw that out. The NADA, and I haven't seen this in, 13, 14 years. They said a 45-day supply is great. And I'm going to go back and quote, a very good parts consultant and a very smart man, Mike Nichols, when they used to put that to them. And I listened to them and I totally get it now, having done this for 25 years. They go, is a 45-day supply the right number? And he goes, no, the right number is whatever you need to satisfy your customer. If that's a 60-day supply or it's a 30-day supply, as long as your techs and your customers are happy, that's the right day's supply without a lot of obsolescence. And, those are the types of things that dealers get really confused on because, you get them in 20 groups, and I kind of call some of those liar's poker, and you wonder where some of these guys get the numbers and pull it up there. And, of course, the guys at the top of the book, they get to beat up the guys at the bottom of the book, and they're all trying to figure out how the guy at the top of the book got there, right? So, that's kind of, it gets confusing to them. And as you found out, Kaylee, and we've known over the years, parts tends to be that black hole because, like you said, there's not a lot of information and a lot of education on that parts department. And that's what we're trying to expose, that, hey, you can turn this into a gold mine, if you just watch it, pay attention to it, and work it right. And that's my passion. That's Cliff's passion and what we do.
Okay, so let's talk about the future and just kind of what's going on in the industry. I'm going to bring up AI a little bit because that's a big topic. So I do want to get Cliff's perspective on AI and that type of technology and how it kind of relates. I wouldn't say that our technology is AI because we've talked about this, but I think people's perceptions or what they think AI is all over the board. So I just kind of want to get your guys' perspective on AI and our technology.
Well, let's start with the layman. Let's start, Cliff is the technology and computer guy. I'm a parts geek. And when I look at AI from a retail perspective at a car dealership, maybe you could say the ASR programs like RIM and Aero with regional demand or whatnot is going to help the manufacturers control their supply chain more effectively. At the dealership level, not so much. Like a technician. AI may help a technician diagnose a car, but it isn't going to turn the wrench and it's not going to replace that starter, okay? And so I see AI can be an important part of helping to streamline some things at the manufacturer and a little bit at the dealership level. We got a long way to go. It always seems like the automotive market, hey, look at the DMS computers we've been talking about. Where's the AI? They haven't rewritten their software programs in 30 years.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So
our question, but I want to hear Cliff's side first.
Yeah. Okay. So probably the greatest benefit of AI to automotive dealerships is probably going to come from sales and marketing, in my opinion. Now, supply chain is most likely the AI is going to come through the manufacturers in the production line. But for dealerships, the concept that PartsEdge follow, which is, have the right parts, have the best possible inventory, the least amount of waste, the ability to service your customers, your market at the highest levels, that will be helped by AI. AI is going to be really good. It's already in place with some manufacturers they're just not making it a big deal. But AI is going to help the DMS and PartsEdge and the dealers pick better parts inventories, maintain better parts inventories. Whether or not that's the difference between being super competitive or not is another issue, because there's a lot more to AI. If AI is going to train your service advisors how to make how to be friendlier to your customers. It's going to train your technicians to be faster, probably help with the diagnostic. But I don't see, until we get to robot service advisors, I don't see the service experience getting a lot more fun through AI. So it seems to me that we're putting a lot of weight on that. And when we talk about it, we tend to talk about, like Chuck, you kind of chuckled when you brought up AI. I smiled a little bit. We keep hearing that the world is going to end at the hands of AI. Certainly if the world ends at the hands of AI, dealerships are going to end with it. So that's not good, but we keep hearing about the worst part about it, what it's going to do. The best part about it, I could tell you, AI right now writes code really well for programmers and projects. It tests code and analyzes code. It can look at 1,000 spreadsheets to come up with the best possible mix of inventory pretty quickly. We've done a little bit of testing with that. Chuck and I are planning on having AI involved in our process as soon as possible. I can't tell you that's going to be tomorrow, right? But there'll be a time when it makes sense, and we'll bring it in. We have a pretty prominent AI company in our building here that does work with auto manufacturers already, so we kind of know what direction they're going. I could tell you that the prospect of everything being done better through AI is great for us, and it should be great for every dealer out there. Like Chuck said, it's not going to turn a wrench for a while until they start making cars that robots can turn wrenches on, or that turn their own wrenches. It's probably not going to, put any parts on a car, but it will at some point be ordering them, and I'm looking forward to it. I think our job gets easier. Chuck and I, we haven't had a lot of discussion on this, but, we're here to bring better results to dealers through knowledge, through education, through, crunching more data, and all AI is going to do is help with that.
Yeah.
And, it can help the dealers directly, but Chuck and I, in the PartsEdge, not just Chuck and I, we've been doing this long enough to where it's likely, we'll be on the cutting edge in helping dealers understand how to use technology that's being presented to them for fixed operations as well.
Kaylee, when I think of AI being the layman of it, it's like this massive, area. And there's one word I think of about 10, 12 years ago that got way overused, and it was synergy. And so when I hear AI, right now it's kind of that overused, where are we going to go with it? It's like, it's the universe. How are we going to capture the universe? Anyway, there you go.
I could see that.
We'll get there.
No, I'm glad I asked that question. I think it's as good as we train it. What I mean by that is the information that we ask and provide, right? That's more of, it learns off of that information. So I guess.
Yeah, it does. Cliff gave me a sampling of it, in Chat GPT. We just played with a little bit about, hey, write me an English statement to do X. And let me tell you, it did really well.
Yeah.
So there's the capabilities out there are endless, but, Cliff said it the best. It's not training us. We got to train it, and it learns really well on its own.
Yeah. So I'd like to expound on something you said there, Kaylee, about what's more important is what we ask it, right? So if you look at tools, and this isn't a technology interview, but if you look at tools like ChatGPT, one of the fastest growing curriculums around ChatGPT is not ChatGPT. When you ask ChatGPT a question, that's called a prompt. Mm-hmm. Colleges are clamoring to educate students in prompt engineering. So it's exactly what you said. They're putting a huge emphasis. If you had a kid in college today, there's a huge emphasis, if you want to go into AI, in learning how to talk to it, how to ask it questions intelligently. So prompt engineering is growing very fast and is a great area to take classes in if you want to learn AI. And really, that's 100% focused on how to ask it the questions you want the answers to. It's not like Siri, where you ask a question and it comes back with an answer. And if you want a slightly different question, ask it a slightly different question, you have to ask the whole question again with your difference in there. Siri doesn't have any contextual memory from one question to the next. ChatGPT, the chat in ChatGPT, you can carry on a conversation with it. Have explained to you the details of inventory control that'll take what would be a whole 8.5 by 11 page full of math and explain every detail to you in plain engineering as to what you need to do to decide whether or not to order a part. I mean, that's the difference. How you ask it, it makes all the difference in the world of the quality of that answer. And so I think that really is the sign of how AI is going to enter the car business for dealers, is they're still going to need to ask it questions the right way,
Yeah.
you know, and to ask it intelligent questions, and not intelligent from an automotive standpoint, but someone has to decide how those questions need to be asked of the technology to get it right. And until the technology learns on its own what the car business is like, we're going to have to, it's almost like interpreting to someone who doesn't speak English. You got to write every question out, interpret it, and then have them read it. And AI is kind of at that level when it comes to the car business. Now, in sales and marketing, deciding whether or not, you're more likely to buy a Lexus after having one cheeseburger or, a Big Mac somewhere, AI is going to get really good at that. And it's moving really fast in that area, looking at your patterns and making decisions. And we think when that gets to parts, it's going to certainly revolutionize the inventory control business.
Yeah, even more than just because I want to go back to the ASRs. So I don't want to say auto stock replenishment programs, because I've said ASR before and people interpret it as something else because I think So going back to that, you mentioned that's kind of a form of AI, right? Or for the manufacturer a little bit. I don't know.
Well, we don't know what they're using to make those decisions. But
That's right.
What really is they're making the decisions for the dealership.
Yeah, they're making the decisions. But I wanted to bring that up because it's something as a salesperson that comes up all the time with parts managers. There's either the ones that don't rely on it, and then there's the ones that rely on it completely. So I want to get your guys' perspective, because when you started PartsEdge, there was no ASRs, right?
None.
So that's what I want to talk about, is that change. Why shouldn't a parts manager rely on it solely, and why they shouldn't, or you know what I'm trying to say? What's the deal with the ASR, and what's your perspective?
Well, yeah, I can sum it up, in two completely different perspectives. Okay, Kaylee? The ASRs were developed by the manufacturers to help control the velocity within their supply chain and manage their inventories at the depot supply point much better. It wasn't really meant, we're going to help you out, guarantee parts that sell. I brought this up one time at a seminar, and I had some manufacturers in the room. I said, if you're so sure of what sells, you want to guarantee it, why don't you use the Walmart, theme? Put the parts in the dealerships on consignment, and the dealers only have to pay for it when it sells. You're so confident of it, why not do it? Well, of course, that died a quick death.
Yeah, we heard from their lawyers. We heard from their lawyers shortly after. We had a couple of phone calls like that, and they thought we were nuts. But, when you look at that kind of a philosophy with these stock replenishment programs, don't be fooled. They were designed for and meant to mainly help the manufacturer, and that's fine. They're the manufacturer. They're the ones, with franchisees, right? But now dial it back down, and this is the whole thing with setting up a DMS or whatever. We look at Toyota and Honda dealerships compared to the ones using stock replenishment. And there's a couple that are okay, manufacturer-wise, but I'm talking the domestics. The Toyota and Honda dealers, with the dealership allowed to set their system up and manage their inventories, are 20 to 30% more effective than any ASR program. And we have hundreds of examples of that. So I'd like to add that many dealers can benefit from ASRs. It's not like the ASRs don't do anything good for the dealers, but they were designed to do good things for the factory. But dealers can do better. The premise of how we started PartsEdge shows that, right? We're proof. What we do, dealers are proof, but what we do is proof that dealers can do better. You can be on an ASR program that makes your dealership a lot more efficient than it was before that program started. But in every single case, you can do better. There is not one ASR program out there that's better than the dealer taking control over major components of that and improving on them. And that's really the problem with ASR if you're a dealer. The problem with ASR if you're a factory by not having it, if you're a factory, is your supply chain is lumpy and has inefficiencies. If you're a dealer, you're getting told what to buy with a guarantee. That's awesome. But if you stop wasting your time worrying about the parts that they're worrying about, you can now focus on a whole different set of parts that really change your day, that make you much more efficient. And that's really the problem with ASRs from dealers is the dealers are going to tell you the easiest part of the inventory to maintain. And if you were having trouble with that, you certainly got an improvement when Dane started doing that for you. You saw an improvement. But now all ASRs are is proof that paying attention with that level of detail will make a difference. That's really what we found. And so that dealers enjoy much more efficient inventories, much better use of factory programs, and in many cases, far less headaches, unless they have a factory rep breathing down their neck every week that their inventory is too big or too small or whatever. They have far less headaches. Pay attention to detail, and those ASRs will work even better for you.
Well, and Kaylee, just summing it up, if ASRs were so good, how come dealership obsolescence is up 12% over the last 5 years?
Since they really can.
They only guarantee what sells. That's an ASR, and they take away return allowance and a lot of other incentives. That right there is the bottom line. It's how you manage the parts that you're ordering that aren't guaranteed much more than the parts that are. The ones that are take care of themselves. That's great. You might have some holding costs or whatnot, but the real key element is tracking the parts that they don't guarantee. That's the key.
What percentage of parts in a standard inventory are not guaranteed that do sell?
40 to 50%. It depends on the manufacturer and the ASR. Our Ford dealers, about 30% on average of their parts is guaranteed. And ironically, Ford really is only recommending high velocity parts that sell a lot. BMW does the same. You get down to GM and Chrysler, and they put more marginal inventory, take more risks, making the dealerships stock a part that the good news is it's guaranteed. The bad news is they have maybe 15 or 20% of it they're going to end up returning anyway, and they bear the holding costs for 12 months or GM's case, 18 months. So that part of it still looks really good. The problem is, when you can't get customers under warranty to prepay, you're large into wholesale, getting returns or whatnot, there's no avenue to be able to get rid of those parts. And so what we've seen, and Cliff and I have gone through this, is obsolescence is growing at dealerships, and they have to look at ways to accrue money because they don't have return allowance. In fact, I've said this over the last 2 years with all the dealers, Kaylee, that we've talked to and whatnot. They come to us with an obsolescence problem. The first thing we have to tell them is you can't buy your way out of it. You can't earn enough return allowance. We're going to have to raise the prices and accrue some money and get more intelligent about the way you get rid of those non-returnable parts. That's what's really changed in the inventory or in automotive dealership parts.
So basically the average is a little over 50% of the inventory is not protected.
Think about it. What would be the brass ring? 100% of your inventory is guaranteed. Nobody's ever going to get that close. We've seen a couple of makes that you can get up around 80, 85%, and one of them happens to be ASR controlled, and they do very well. But that's what I always tell everybody. The brass ring, or fantasy, it'd be 100% of your parts are guaranteed. Reality is more like about, 50% of your inventory is guaranteed or less.
Yeah, the guaranteed part of it, we focus on that, but that only solves part of the problem, right? If you look at National Retail Association have numbers like 24 to 36% per year holding cost on items for retail. Now dealerships, some of them are more like warehouses, some of them are more like, are bona fide retail outlets with retail real estate that they have to pay for, even for parts. Most of them are in that category. It's not cheap to store a part. If they guarantee them for a year, you might buy that part. Say you buy a part for $100. When you give it back to them at the end of that guarantee because it didn't sell, you might have spent $35 to store them for the year. Right? They're getting free storage. The factories are getting free storage. That's, their margin would be like, 35, 40% of margin when they sell them, maybe a little more. They make most of their profit in not having to store the part. In that case, it could at least. And so the fact that the parts are guaranteed is only solves half the dealer's problem with it. If they still ordered the wrong part, they still have the wrong part for a year if they do have it. So go ahead, Chuck.
Well, and just to expand on that, Cliff, and I haven't seen this probably now for 10, 12 years, but they had some CPAs that came out that Cliff talking about holding costs. They actually will tell you that if based on a 40% profit margin, okay, which is what we all pretty much had lived off of for the longest time, off of a 40% profit margin, if you sell a part at retail at a 40% profit margin and you've had it in your inventory 10 months, you're at break even. Anything past that, now you're starting to lose money on it.
Yeah, so, right there is the problem with ASRs.
Yep.
Who cares if they're guaranteed?
Yeah.
If I hold your part for 16 months, I think it's going to be pretty hard for me to make money on it. I'm glad I'm going to get my money back when I return it. But should I have ever had that in the first place?
Yeah, good point. Right there. That sums it up.
So it's valid for parts managers to be concerned with or not accept everything.
Yeah.
And you really look at data and understand why and how parts are coming into inventory.
Yeah. And that's why we say, even with ASRs, if you pay close attention, you can always improve on it.
Yeah, the manufacturers, Kaylee, depending on the manufacturer, they have to either be 80 to 95% compliant. They have to accept 8 out of every 10 parts that are suggested or 9.5 because they get incentives, return allowance, whatever. But the point being, too many times we see parts managers, he or she has gotten really busy and they're at 98, 99%, where they could be at 85 or 86%. What you want to be is just a couple of percent above what you need, and you can still have a very good and efficient inventory. You don't have to take 100% of what they're recommending.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had 2 final questions as we wrap up to an hour. So one of them was, so this one we may have already answered, but I just want to ask it directly. What impact do you hope that PartsEdge has on the industry?
Well, sum it up, make their inventories more efficient. Again, I'm going to go back to the mission statement, Kaylee. Minimize mistakes, maximize profit opportunities. Literally every dealership we go into, we see them leaving money on the table, either through inventory control, bad pricing practices. What we want to do is see the dealerships making customers happy, turning a good profit. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, we have cars too. We want to be able to go to dealerships and get good service and parts available when we need them.
Amen.
Our overall impact our specific impact on the industry, and if it could be all dealers, it'd be nice that we're all dealers. But we have a small section of the dealer body as our clients. But what I think our impact should be more profitable, more efficient, smoother supply chain for every dealer in the business, because of the efficiency of many or most of the dealers. Factories, the top 20% of their dealers might move 80% of their cars. If they could make those dealers 10% more efficient, it would affect how all the dealers from that manufacturer get parts. And it would change prediction algorithms. It would change AI algorithms, for stocking. Depots might have, more parts that everybody needs if a certain percentage of their dealers were more efficient. So I think overall, when you ask what impact PartsEdge should have on the industry, I think the whole industry should win through the efficiency gained by clearer and, I want to say, more intelligent, but this is not a matter of lack of intelligence everywhere else, but more informed. That's probably a better way to say it. More informed stocking decisions on behalf of the dealers will make the factories more efficient, will make their supply chain more efficient, and everybody will win. I mean, theoretically, it might cost less to own a vehicle if the supply chains were more efficient, right? The factories could be more competitive with their parts and their cars and make more people happy. So the overall effect is the efficiency brings a win for everybody.
Yeah, the efficiency is a big piece. I feel like I've been talking about that a lot this year.
Well, and you got to remember, and we sat with a manufacturer once, and I'll never forget this statement, that they actually called the aftermarket sales of OE parts, and I'll explain that. The manufacturer, 97% of their supply chain is building the cars on the production line. Once they're out and sold, only 3% of their overall parts end up in the after sales. Okay? That's incredible.
So this is not a big priority for the factories. It wasn't until CSI became an issue.
Right.
Yeah. I'd like to cover one thing too. So our impact on the whole industry is everybody wins through efficiency. Our impact on the industry, just as it relates to the dealers that work with us, we want them to be enormously efficient, enormously profitable, right? And we want to show them an easier way to make money in fixed ops. And I say easier because with our help, they do less work. It's easier for them.
Right.
A specific impact on our dealers is it's easier to sell parts and service because of what we do.
Okay.
Amen.
Good question. This is something that comes up with dealers, and I don't know if we'll use this or not, but I just want to ask it on your guys' perspective. When a dealer says, isn't that my parts manager's job to do all these things that we're talking about, what would you say to that dealer or GM?
That's easy. It's their job to do everything more efficiently. But if you can find a sharper tool in the shed or a program that can help you save time and build profitability and control the inventory more effectively, sure, that's the parts manager's job. But, and Kaylee, you've heard me say this 50 times, and it's so true. A parts manager, they wear 50 fire hats every day. If the parts manager could have 10 of those fire hats done much more effectively, they're allowed to focus more efficiently on the important things and not be chained to these other hats. That right there in a nutshell, that to me, a parts manager is like a banker. They're like investment people. Those are dollar bills hanging out of those parts shelves. Getting the best return on investment, why doesn't the dealer just put their money in the bank if they can get a better return? And the parts manager's job is to find the best tools and people available to accomplish the job more efficiently to increase profits.
There's another part of this too. A parts manager's responsibility is to keep a clean working environment. How many dealers would fire their parts manager if he walked into the parts department at 4:00 in the afternoon? The parts manager's got a broom sweeping the floor. There are certain things that help a parts manager get their job done that they shouldn't be doing. And much of the stuff we do is focusing on things that a parts manager should have to focus on every day, right? Let us focus on it. And so of course you pay your parts manager to do this. Again, another analogy is the power tool analogy. If you had a technician's job is to do maintenance on vehicles, to service vehicles. How many dealerships would hire a technician that showed up without a single power tool and said thought he was just as good without them? Right? So there are times where, as a dealership, you pick the methodology you want your managers or your techs or your parts people to follow. And, even if they thought they could get the job done without a power tool, most dealerships wouldn't hire a mechanic that refused to use power tools. And dealers do refer to what we do as a power tool for parts managers. So I think typically the dealers that would say that probably don't really understand what we're going to do for them. To me, it's never a surprise that dealers would say that. Chuck and I used to hear that years ago. I pay my parts manager to do that, and it's because we weren't very good at convincing the dealers that we were talking to what we were going to do for them. Of course, your parts manager is responsible for a better inventory. Of course, they're responsible for finding the tools. We just, for so many years, expected that the tool was the parts manager using their own brain on their own inventory, on their own counter pad, to override maybe even the DMS to produce a certain result. And what we offer is that without the parts manager having to do that.
Exactly. So I think that's the thing is the parts managers have a hard time trusting the system because they don't have that time to spend to set it up and trust it.
Right. And that's so that you hit it right on the head. What we produce is a believable system for the dealer. Not that the system's not believable, but generally it's not set up in a way. The DMS companies set them all up the same way. They think every dealer is the same. We've seen two Ford dealers or two Toyota dealers 10 miles apart that have completely different settings to produce an efficient inventory. The DMS companies set them both up the same when they sold them and installed it, right? So what we produce is a believable system that you can trust. When you see something show up on a screen, you can trust it. And that's something that not every dealership sees. They don't experience that. Every DMS company has a hard time producing that type of trust in the system. But, we set them up in a way, and any dealer can do this. We're experts at it. But we set the system up in a way to where at our end sometimes we have people that have never worked in a car dealership doing highly efficient stock orders. Parts managers call us up and say, that's a great stock order. Chunk must have done it. It's like, well, no, it's our person last week. They were, working in a Walmart and they need your stock order. We had someone that worked in a trampoline park that can do stock orders better than most parts managers because we set the system up and you can believe what you see on the screen and you can make great decisions with that. And so that's a perfect point, Kaylee, is that there's not a lot of trust in these systems. And that's something we bring to the picture too. And it comes from just you pay detailed attention to what's going on the computer, focus on the right stuff, make sure the information gets in and out the right way, and you can believe what you see on almost every screen.
But
that's how we achieve that.
When you say paying closer attention, it's the technology that we created that's paying closer attention. Because what my mind thinks like a human, you're hiring a human to pay closer attention. Whereas
you are to a certain extent, right? So what does someone have to know about a dealership's inventory to make it more efficient? Well, there are plenty of operational things, sourcing, source accounting, phase in, phase out, day supply. Those are all Chuck's expertise, right? How you manage those in the system. And when you decide to move a part from a source that's got a 3 and 9 to a 4 and 9 phase in, right? To help the dealership make better decisions the next time that part shows up on the radar, right? When you do that is the attention to detail I'm talking about. You look at the history, you look at the part, you look at how many is sold, and it's not a cut and dry equation. For a tire, it's totally different than it is for a water pump. Every DMS will set up those different, but not every DMS company or parts department has the time to do that. So we decide when they need to be different and how different they need to be and what system settings have to be in place across the board. We also understand, not to go too far down this road, we understand that a rental system might make the decision slightly different than a CDK system. So we understand how to implement a setting on a CDK system. And if that dealer moves to a rental system, or we want to apply the same thought process to a rental system, we know what we have to do different to make it work there just as well. Right? And so that's the attention to detail. And we have an automated way of looking at much of that. Some of it's still manual. I wish it wasn't, but some of these DMS companies are not easy to gather information from. Sometimes you have to pull something up on a screen, look at it for an hour, make decisions, type some things into the computer, and then look tomorrow to see what happened to the parts that were affected by that. I wish there was an automated, I wish AI will fix that for us, right? I wish there was an easier way to do it, but that's what we do in the dealerships. If you have a parts manager that has time to do that, I can't imagine what's not getting done at the dealership that has to get done. It's more important than that every day because the manager's focusing on stuff like this. And we have a whole crew of people that do it in their sleep.
Hey, and, to bring this up, Kaylee, I'll sum this up in 30 seconds because we had the conversation yesterday. I'm going to go back 25 years. It got brought up in a conversation with the fixed ops director yesterday, who will remain nameless. He brought up the milk and the canned asparagus. Wow. We're putting our milk in the same source as our canned asparagus. I couldn't believe that. I've been saying that since I started, and that's what we see in the industry a lot of times, Kaylee, is, parts managers. I can't blame the DMS vendor because they come in, they set it up, and they go, this is the best way it'll work for you. Go ahead and figure it out on your own after that. But a lot of managers, they just leave the milk with the canned asparagus. And now, what do you set your day supply for? What do you set your phasing criteria for? Using those two different commodities from a grocery store, that I heard that after 25 years again, I just cracked up, that it really stuck with him. So anyway, there you go.
Well, it's stuck because I keep putting it out there in our content.
Oh, you're the one.
Keep putting it out there.
Well, he had actually heard this at one of my seminars. So, if you remember. So, anyway. But, we help to break out the milk from the canned asparagus, a.k.a. the maintenance parts from the tires, from the accessories, and so forth. That's important this day and age. It really is. We're working on a much more robust way of reporting what we do. We already think our reporting is cutting edge. We think we can take it to a completely different degree with graphing or whatnot to make it more efficient for dealers. That's what we're working on.
Yeah. So I don't know how far you want to go down this road, but, we've been in development on a portal for over a year now. We're getting ready to roll it out. And the main point of the portal from a PartsEdge standpoint and our clients is we're developing a better way and a more efficient way to communicate critical information back and forth. And for our clients to be able to log in and see the effects of things we've done and they've done in their inventory almost immediately. Make much more informed decisions with a much shorter window from effort to measurement and result. And what we are looking for out of that is a much more efficient way to work with a much larger number of clients.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And then what comes with that, which is part of the don't I pay my parts manager to do this, comes with that is a varying degree of interaction with dealerships. So we have parts managers now that get everything we do and call when they see something they want to change. We have other dealerships that interact with us almost daily that everything that they see, they have a question about. Right? They might be new. They might not have time to dive into the details. They just want us to tell them the short version of, the problem. The portal is being designed to accommodate the whole spectrum of communication with our clients, mainly with our clients, and at the same time provide us, which is kind of in-house, house talk, a better way to track, requests, reporting, issues, items, automatically take a question from a client and present it to a whole group of people that can collectively answer it at one time, with all the project manager that comes with that. So we're really looking forward to that. And I think, it's going to mean something to us in about a month here. It's going to mean something to the first set of our clients in about another month after that. And by a year from now, it should be what drives, our whole process with our dealers.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Excited for the future.
And by the way, there is an easy place to plug in AI, interaction right into that, which, we're not going to plug it in from day one, but when AI is available to what we do, we know right where to put it.
Good. So we're planning for the future.
Yes.
The things that are happening in the industry.
You bet.
Head industry, I guess, too.
Yes.
Lots of technology. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. PartsEdge, the power tool for your parts department. We hope you're leaving feeling motivated, challenged, and inspired.